Madam President, I made my second trip to the southern border just this last Friday with, I believe, 14 of my Democratic Senate colleagues. It's the largest congressional delegation I've ever been part of for this type of assignment. We went to McAllen, Texas. Approximately 40% of those who present themselves at our border come through this McAllen, Texas post. There's a port of entry there, but many people, of course, are detained when they present themselves at nearby border positions. Just a few months before, I had been to El Paso, Texas, and in El Paso, about 20% of those who come to our southern border present themselves as well. It was an eye-opener and an emotional experience to see the hundreds of people who were being held in detention at our border in McAllen. There were two contrasting images. One of them was the image of a Catholic nun, Sister Norma Pimentel, who has for most of her adult life dedicated herself to those who come to our border seeking rescue, security. Catholic Charities of McAllen, Texas, has an extraordinary center filled with volunteers from all over the United States. I met some people from the city of Chicago and state of Illinois and all across the nation who had given up their daily lives to come down and volunteer and do the basics: cook food, clean up, pass out toiletries, offer a helping hand to many people who had just gone through the worst struggle in their lives. Sister Norma is an extraordinary person, and she has really touched the hearts of so many people in her caring, loving way. It is a reminder, time and again, of the goodness of so many Americans who want to tell the world that we are, in fact, a nation driven by values of importance. It was my good fortune to have breakfast with her and then spend another part of my day with her and my Senate colleagues. That hour I'll never forget. When I saw these people, many of whom had struggled for weeks, a month, days and days to get to the border of the United States. They'd gone through experiences, life experience, which we wouldn't wish on anyone. They were victims of assault and rape, of crimes that were committed against them, but they were leaving determined to come to the United States border. Many of them told stories, particularly from the countries of Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras, about what they had been through and the threats to their families in these countries which are largely lawless now, as these drug gangs and others threatened their children and threatened them. It was in desperation that many of them made this journey, cashing in everything they owned on earth to try to make it to the border of the United States. Theirs is today's story, but it really is the story of this country that goes back for many years. It was 108 years ago that my grandmother decided to make her journey to the United States with 3 small children. She brought her 2 daughters and her son from the country of Lithuania to become immigrants to the United States. Her 2-year-old daughter, which she carried in her arms, was my mother, and I am the proud son of that Lithuanian immigrant. Why did they come to the United States? Simply because they heard there was a better chance for a better future if they made it here. That's the story of this country. And we are being tested now at this time in this generation as to whether that story is still alive. Now we understand there's some basics here I hope we can all agree on. Perhaps some won't, but I believe are important. The first is we need border security. In an age of terrorism with the worst drug epidemic in the history of our nation, it is right for us to know who is coming into this country and what they are bringing into our country. Secondly, we want to make certain that anyone who is known to be a danger to this country is never allowed admittance, and those who are here undocumented, who commit a serious crime, have forfeited their right to stay as far as I'm concerned. No questions asked beyond that. The third thing is we have to have an orderly immigration system. We cannot absorb every person in the world who wants to come to the United States at this moment. It just is not in our best interest. It really isn't in theirs either. We need an orderly immigration process. But the question we have to ask ourselves, if we agree on those three things, can we then agree that we have a broken immigration system that needs to be repaired? Can we agree that people who do present themselves at the border will be treated in a humane fashion? I told the story of Sister Norma, but if you look at the immigration policy of the Trump administration, you find a much different message to the world. We remembered when this president initiated his presidency by establishing a Muslim travel ban, creating chaos at airports across the country, and continuing to separate thousands of American families. We remember the policy of this administration when the president announced the repeal of DACA. DACA, the Deferred Action for Children, is a program that grew out of the DREAM Act, a bill which I introduced about 18 years ago. It was a bill that said, or an executive decision actually, under President Obama, which said if you were brought to this country as a child, your parents made the decision to come, you were just along for the ride, but you lived in this country, got an education in this country, didn't create serious crimes in this country, you deserve a chance. You got up every morning in the school and pledged allegiance to that flag and believed it was your own. And then probably when you're about 10 or 12, someone in the family told you something that you'd never heard before. You were not legally in America. What should we do with these young people? Well, when I introduced this bill 18 years ago, my plan was to give them a chance to earn their way to legal status, finish their education, make certain that they have no serious criminal record, be willing to serve this country in the armed forces, and so many of them are, be willing to go on to school, develop a degree in teaching, engineering, nursing, medicine, and then we'd give you a chance for a green card and a path to legalization and citizenship in America. In 18 years, I've never been able to make this the law of the land, but I prevailed on President Obama to create a program based on this premise, and he created the DACA program. 780,000 young people in America stepped up, paid a $600 filing fee, went through a criminal background check, and they were given permission to stay in this country without fear of deportation and permission to work in this country as well. Who are they? There are so many different people. I've introduced them on the floor today, or in other days, I should say, with color photographs telling their stories. The ones I think of immediately, the stars of the class as far as I'm concerned, are the more than 30 of these DACA students who are currently enrolled in Loyola's School of Medicine in Chicago. They made the competition for the School of Medicine open to DACA recipients, and they competed openly and won 32 slots. In order to pay for their education, because they don't qualify for federal assistance to go to school, my state of Illinois loans them money. And for each year that they are loaned money, they promise to serve a year once they are licensed physicians in an area of medical need in my state. What a wonderful program that takes into account their skills and talent and our need in the state for medical care in rural communities, in small-town America, and in the inner city of Chicago and other big cities in my state. Well, the President of the United States decided to end the program that made them eligible to apply for medical school. And in making that decision, the President jeopardized the completion of their medical degrees. Because you see, no matter how hard they work, that medical degree leads to a residency where they learn how to practice medicine hands-on, and a residency is a job. And to be legally entitled to work in this country, you need to have DACA protection, which President Trump took away. So many of them face the prospect that their medical education would end because of the President's decision. Fortunately for them, a case was brought in federal court to try to stop President Trump from eliminating DACA, and it provided as well that the program would continue with its protections until the court case was resolved. That could happen, and it could happen soon. But it tells you what happens when the President makes a decision that affects so many lives and the damage that it can do, not just to them and their families, but to our nation. The President also terminated a temporary protected status program that protected some 300,000 people who've come to the United States over the years because of adverse natural disasters or political conditions in their country. Then the President, last year, initiated a program called Zero Tolerance that resulted in the disastrous separation of thousands of families at the border. Because a federal court mandated, the administration had to account for the children who were separated. There were some 2,880 infants, toddlers, and children taken away from their parents, some with lies about where these children were going and how soon they'd be returned. And when the court said in Southern California to the Trump administration, account for these children, tell us where they are today, tell us where their parents are, they couldn't even match up all the children with the parents, because many of the parents had been sent back to their countries with the promise their children would return, and there was no record keeping so that that could be done. This president also was engaged through his Department of Homeland Security in migrant detention facilities, which the Inspector General of the Department of Homeland Security found, and I quote, an immediate risk to the health and safety of detainees and federal employees. I saw one in April of this year in El Paso. We had a detention facility there where we were holding those who were presented at the border. The sign over the wall, over the door of that detention cell said capacity 35. I looked through the plate glass window. There were 150 men standing shoulder to shoulder. They ate standing up. There was no room for all of them to lie down to sleep. I was told a couple weeks later that the population census had grown to 200 in that cell that was designed for 35 with one toilet. Next to it was a detention cell with another plate glass window. Over the door, it said capacity 18. I counted 75 women, and some with nursing children, in that room designed for 18 people with one toilet. That situation is unacceptable, inhumane. Regardless of the legal outcome of those who presented themselves, we can and must do better as a nation. The Inspector General was right. That condition that I saw was a risk to health and safety. Then the president, through a series of his infamous tweets, threatened mass arrest and deportations of millions of immigrants who have committed no crime and pose no threat to the safety and security of their communities. What the president has done is created rampant fear in the immigrant communities around Illinois and around this nation. Then the president put in place a new rule that blocks asylum claims at our border from nationals of any country except Mexico, including families and children fleeing persecution. The UNHCR, the United Nations Refugee Agency, said that the rule that the president promulgated will endanger vulnerable people in need of international protection from violence or prosecution. Now the president is continuing on his path of destruction. He is considering reducing the number of refugees the United States will admit in the year 2020 to 0. Madam President, you have to go back in history to World War II, when the President of the United States, a member of my own political party, made a conscious decision to tell those Jewish people coming from Europe that they would not be allowed admittance into the United States to escape the Nazi Holocaust. The story of the SS St. Louis is one that people should read and consider the 800 passengers on that ship who were rejected by the administration as refugees sent back to Europe. A fourth of them died in the Holocaust. Because of our feeling of shame after World War II, the United States, under presidents of both political parties, said that we would try to set a standard for the world when it came to accepting refugees, and we did. An average of almost 80,000 per year admitted into the United States. Think back to the Cubans who came to this country to escape communism under Castro. They have become such a vibrant part of America today. And in fact, 3 of the senators today are of Cuban descent. They were part of that refugee movement. Maybe not their generation, but in their family. And then, of course, we've accepted Jewish people from the Soviet Union who were being persecuted. Soviet Jews found a welcoming America. The Vietnamese who risked their lives to fight on our side in that horrible war were welcomed into the United States rather than see them face persecution in their own countries. The story goes on and on. And for years and years, for decades, the United States established a standard of caring when it came to refugees. Now this president has announced that despite all of the turmoil in the world, we cannot accept a single refugee in the year 2020. What a departure from the high-minded and high-value conduct of previous presidents. Since the enactment of the Refugee Act of 1980, the United States has been resettling over 80,000 refugees per year under administrations of both political parties. President Trump has said he will end it. For the last 2 years, the Trump administration has set the lowest refugee ceilings in history in the midst of the worst refugee crisis in history. Now, the administration may slam the door at least for a year or until someone prevails on the president. Now today, as in almost every day, the administration has announced a new rule that allows immigration officers to arrest and deport undocumented immigrants anywhere in the United States unless that person can prove that they have been in the United States for at least 2 years. I ask you, if someone stopped you on the street and said, prove you've been here for 2 years, how long would it take you to gather the documentation to make that proof, if you can? And to do this to people and to threaten to deport them on the spot immediately if they don't produce the documentation is totally unfair. This procedure, known as expedited removal, allows an immigrant to be deported without consulting with an attorney or counselor or defending themselves in a hearing before an immigration judge. Summary judgment on the street to deport people and tear families apart. America is better than this. We can certainly keep America safe and respect our heritage as a nation of immigrants. We can have a secure border and abide by our international obligations to protect refugees fleeing persecution, as we've done on a bipartisan basis for decades. When I went and toured the McAllen Border Patrol stations, Donna and Ursula, we met with many of the leaders there and saw firsthand what is happening. We are starting to build facilities that will be more humane, at least by design, and I hope that's exactly what happens. And I'd like to say a word about the men and women who work for Customs and Border Protection. I'm not going to make any excuses for those who have abused people in the past, those who have said horrible things online about them, no excuses at all. But the people I met as part of our government service on the border were overwhelmingly good and caring people who were confronted with a situation at the border that they never envisioned, with circumstances beyond their control. So I want to say a word for those who are doing the best they can under these extraordinary circumstances and thank them for their service. The reality is that President Trump's policies, as harsh and cruel as they've been, have been ineffective at our southern border. The situation there is much less secure than when he took office. The president's obsession with a border wall led to the longest government shutdown in history, even paralyzing our immigration courts for that 35-day period. More refugees have been driven to the border because the president has shut down the legal avenues for migration and blocked all assistance to stabilize the Northern Triangle countries. Under President Obama, we set up in-country, in Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras, an opportunity for those to come forward who wished and apply for asylum status in the United States without leaving their home country, if they chose to do it. It was one alternative to an expensive, dangerous trek to the southern border. The Trump administration closed down that program, giving the people in those countries no other alternative but to try to make that trip to the border. That made no sense at all. There's also a gaping leadership vacuum at the Department of Homeland Security. In the 2.5 years the president has been in office, there have been 4 different leaders in the Office of Secretary in the Department of Homeland Security. And in every major sub-cabinet position, whether it's Interior Enforcement or Border Enforcement, there have been at least as many people acting in acting capacity and not in a permanent capacity. I would say that we have tried our best to work with this administration when they've asked for help and volunteered it when they didn't. Last February, when we passed the omnibus bill, we included over $400 million for humanitarian assistance at the border. And when the president came back and asked for an emergency supplemental of $4.6 billion for additional funding, Democrats joined with Republicans to pass that legislation. Last year, before the border crisis began, Senate Democrats supported a bipartisan agreement, including robust border security, funding, and dozens of provisions to strengthen border security. The president threatened to veto it. and instead pushed for a hardline approach, which, when it was called for a vote in the United States Senate, received fewer than 40 votes. 6 years ago, in 2013, there was a proud moment on this Senate floor, and there aren't many to recall as we stand here today, but this was one of them. I was part of a gang of 8, 4 Democrats and 4 Republican senators who worked for months, Senator John McCain, Chuck Schumer, and so many others, to put together a comprehensive immigration reform bill. We brought it to the floor of the Senate. It passed 68 to 32. It was a step in a move in the right direction to deal with our broken immigration system. Unfortunately, the Republican House leadership refused to even consider that bill or call it for a hearing. Acting Secretary of Department of Homeland Security, Kevin McAleenan, recently said that if our bill in 2013 had been enacted into law, and I quote, "we would have a very different situation. We would be a lot more secure at our border." And Republican Senator Lamar Alexander of Tennessee, who supported that 2013 bill, said, and I quote, "if that bill became law, most of the problems we're having today we'd not be having." We had a path, a bipartisan path, a good path that we should return to. It is time for us to find a way to work together for a secure border, for a secure nation, to reduce the massive amounts of money that are being spent now because of this migration, and to do it in a humane fashion consistent with the values of the United States. We're ready to work with the Republicans. Democrats on this side of the aisle are ready to work to achieve goals that I think we all share. We need to address the root causes in the Northern Triangle countries that drive migrants to flee to the United States. We need to crack down on the traffickers and transporters who are exploiting these migrants. We need to provide for in-country processing of refugees and expand third-country resettlement so that migrants can find safe haven without making that dangerous trek. We need to eliminate immigration court backlogs so that asylum claims can be processed more quickly. We need to expand the use of proven alternatives to detention, like family case management, so that immigrants know their rights and show up for court. Mr. President, it was hard to believe, but when we went to Sister Norma's Catholic Charity Center in McAllen, some of the migrants who had gone through the system and were now heading to join family members in the United States showed us the packets they were given with legal documents. Now understand, these people were fresh off the border, out of detention. And as we looked inside the packets, we found, in many cases, the instructions were printed in English, not Spanish, and they did not include any specific time or place for the person to report. They simply typed in there, "to be determined, to be determined." Is it any wonder that these people struggle to come to a court hearing as required by law? We can do better. We ought to give them the information they need if they're going to be part of our legal system, and tell them about the time and place where they need to report. We stand ready to work on this side of the aisle for smart, effective, and humane border security policies. We need to have a bipartisan approach. Republican colleagues need to step up and find a constructive way to deal with the challenges we face on the border today. We can keep America safe. We can continue to proudly call ourselves a nation of immigrants. What we're seeing now is a situation which begs for a bipartisan compromise solution. Mr. President, I yield the floor and suggest the absence of quorum.